I thought I ruined everything. One slip, one glass of red wine, and the bride's perfect dress was stained. My cheeks burned with shame. But then, out of nowhere, he appeared, a man everyone whispered about, the billionaire guest. Instead of anger, he smiled at me, and everything changed. I never imagined one simple moment could change the way I saw myself, or even love itself. This is my story, told from the heart, and if you've ever believed in fate or in the power of unexpected moments, then you'll want to stay with me until the very end. What happened after that billionaire looked into my eyes still feels unreal, and I promise it's a journey worth hearing. And before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe and follow, because I share more powerful love stories that might just touch your heart and change how you see life. I grew up knowing I wasn't the kind of woman people noticed when I entered a room. Not because I wasn't worthy, but because life had a way of making me feel small. My days were simple, filled with work, bills, and quiet evenings, where the only sound was the hum of my old fan. I lived paycheck to paycheck, doing what I could to keep my head above water, and though I smiled often, I carried the kind of loneliness you learn to hide well. I worked at a small office downtown, nothing glamorous, typing reports, answering calls, and making sure my boss never forgot his coffee. It wasn't that I hated my job, but I knew deep down it wasn't where my dreams lived. It was just survival, and most days I told myself that survival was enough. My friends from work often went out after hours, but I usually went home. Between exhaustion and the fear of never quite fitting in, I kept to myself. Even though I carried myself with pride, I was no stranger to feeling out of place. I'd see women with polished nails, designer bags, and an air of confidence that I couldn't even pretend to wear. I'd glance down at my scuffed shoes or my thrifted dress and feel invisible. I told myself I didn't need to belong in their world, but a quiet part of me always longed to. When the wedding invitation came, tucked neatly in an envelope that smelled faintly of roses, I almost threw it away. The bride was a distant cousin I hadn't seen in years, and though we were family by name, our lives couldn't have been more different. She moved in circles I only read about in glossy magazines, wealthy, polished, admired. Me? I was just the relative nobody remembered until they needed to fill a seat. I remember holding that invitation, staring at the golden letters pressed into the paper. I wanted to say no. I wanted to spare myself the awkward stares and the silent judgments I knew were waiting. But something inside me whispered yes. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fate, but I decided to go. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with nerves. I stood in front of my closet staring at clothes that suddenly looked too plain, too worn. I didn't have money for a new dress, so I made the best of what I had. I picked out a simple navy dress, ironed it carefully, and told myself confidence would have to be my accessory. My reflection in the mirror didn't scream wedding guest, but I promised myself I would hold my head high. On the morning of the wedding, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I kept asking myself, why am I even going? I could have stayed home, curled up with a book, safe from the eyes that would surely measure me against standards I could never meet. But as I slipped into my dress and brushed back my curls, I reminded myself of one truth: life doesn't change if you hide from it. I carried that thought with me as I left my small apartment and stepped into the world that felt much bigger than mine. The drive to the venue was filled with doubts, but beneath them was a flicker of something else, a strange hope I couldn't explain. I didn't know then that the decision to attend would be the first step toward a night I would never forget. The wedding venue looked like something pulled straight from a dream. The moment I stepped through the tall glass doors, I felt my breath catch. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed impossibly high, their light bouncing off polished marble floors. flowers draped across every table, and the air smelled of roses and champagne. I had never been in a place so elegant, and suddenly, my navy dress felt even plainer than it had that morning. Guests moved around me with the kind of grace that comes from belonging. Women in glittering gowns glided across the room, their laughter like music, while men in sharp tuxedos carried themselves with ease. I tried to smile, tried to blend in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a single note out of tune in a perfect symphony. Every step I took echoed too loudly in my mind, and I was certain eyes were following me, whispering questions I couldn't hear. I found a corner near the refreshment table, hoping to disappear into the background. My hands clutched a glass of red wine like it was a shield, though I barely dared to sip it. I watched people embrace, old friends and new connections weaving stories that I wasn't a part of. It was like standing in the middle of a stage where everyone else knew their lines, and I hadn't even been handed a script. The bride was radiant, her gown glittering as if it had been spun from starlight itself. She floated from guest to guest, her smile wide and effortless. For a moment, I admired her beauty, the way she seemed so at home in a world I could only ever peek into. But then, my admiration twisted into self-doubt. I tugged at my dress, wishing it could transform into something that shimmered under the lights. Whispers carried through the room, little threads of gossip weaving into the air. I caught one name more than once, the billionaire guest. People spoke of him like he was both myth and man, someone whose presence alone made the night unforgettable. I had never seen him, but I imagined the type. Tall, confident, untouchably wealthy. The kind of man who lived a life so far above mine that we might as well be on different planets. I tried not to look for him, tried not to let the thought of him unsettle me. But curiosity has a way of creeping in, no matter how much you fight it. My eyes scanned the crowd, brushing over jeweled dresses and polished shoes, searching for a figure that matched the whispers. And when I thought I had spotted him across the room, my chest tightened. He wasn't what I expected. There was no arrogant smirk, no air of untouchable pride. Instead, he carried himself with quiet authority, his smile rare but striking, like it was reserved only for moments that truly mattered. I quickly looked away, embarrassed at myself for staring. He was surrounded by people, everyone vying for his attention, and I reminded myself that I didn't belong in his orbit. I was just a guest in borrowed confidence, standing on the edges of a world that wasn't mine. Still, my heart beat faster, and I couldn't explain why. The longer I stayed, the more restless I became. My glass of wine grew lighter in my hand, though I had barely touched it. My palms were damp, and I shifted from foot to foot, searching for a way to escape without drawing attention. I told myself I'd stay just long enough to be polite, just long enough not to offend family, and then I'd leave quietly into the night. But fate has a way of ignoring our plans, because in the next moment, as I turned to step aside, everything I had feared, the eyes, the whispers, the embarrassment, came crashing into reality in a single, clumsy accident. It happened in a heartbeat. 1 second, I was stepping to the side, trying to give space to a passing waiter, and the next, my hand brushed against someone's shoulder. The glass tilted, the red liquid swirled, and before I could react, wine spilled like a streak of fire across the bride's perfect white gown. The sound that followed was louder than any music playing. Gasps filled the air, sharp and heavy. My stomach dropped as if the floor had been pulled out from under me. I froze, the empty glass still trembling in my hand, my breath locked somewhere between my chest and my throat. The bride's eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief as she stared at the crimson stain spreading like a wound across her dress. I whispered an apology, soft, shaky, desperate, but the words felt too small against the weight of the moment. The crowd around us shifted, murmurs rising like a tide. I could feel the heat of their stares pressing down on me, each one sharper than the last. My face burned, and all I wanted to do was disappear. The bride lifted her hand, not in anger, but in stunned silence. I thought she might scream, demand I be thrown out, or burst into tears. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her reaction, and in that suffocating pause, I felt like the world's clumsiest, most unwelcome guest. I wanted to run. My legs ached to move, but they wouldn't obey. My fingers clutched at the hem of my dress, twisting the fabric as if holding myself together could undo what I'd done. Shame washed over me, hot and heavy, until I could barely stand upright. Then, from somewhere just beyond the crowd, a voice broke through the tension, smooth, calm, unhurried. It wasn't raised, but it carried in a way that silenced the whispers. Everyone turned, their attention pulled like a magnet. I followed their gaze, my breath catching in my chest. There he was, the billionaire guest. His presence filled the space, not because he demanded it, but because it clung to him naturally. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes on me, not on the stain, not on the bride, but directly, unwaveringly on me. And then, to my shock, he smiled. The corners of his mouth curved with warmth, not mockery. His gaze softened as though he saw through the chaos and embarrassment that clung to me. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. In that moment, when I was sure I'd ruined everything, when I felt small and crushed beneath 1,000 eyes, he looked at me as if none of it mattered, as if I wasn't the mistake everyone else saw, but something else entirely. And with that smile, the night shifted in ways I never could have imagined. The moment he smiled, I felt the world tilt. It was so unexpected, so disarming, that for a second I forgot the red stain spreading across the bride's gown, forgot the whispers circling me like vultures. His eyes met mine, steady and sure, and I felt something I hadn't felt all night. Seen, truly seen. He took another step forward, closing the space between us. Every pair of eyes in the room followed him, waiting to see what he would say. I braced myself, ready for a sharp remark, some clever jab to ease the tension at my expense, but his voice carried something else entirely, gentleness. "You're the most beautiful one here." The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water, rippling outward until the whole room seemed to shiver. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My lips parted, but no sound came. I blinked, my chest rising and falling too quickly as the words sank deeper. The crowd gasped. A few people exchanged stunned glances, their eyes wide, their mouths curving into surprised half-smiles. The bride shifted uncomfortably, her hands brushing at the stain, but even she couldn't hide the way the air had changed. Attention no longer clung to her dress. It clung to me. Heat rushed to my cheeks. My heart hammered so hard, I thought the sound might betray me. I wanted to shrink into the floor, but his gaze wouldn't let me. There was no pity in his eyes, no mockery, only a strange certainty that rattled me to my core. I whispered, "What?" before I could stop myself. The word cracked in the air, soft and unbelieving. He only smiled wider, as if repeating himself wasn't necessary, as if he knew that in the quiet disbelief of my question, I had already carried his words with me. The room began to stir again, conversations bubbling back to life, though now laced with curiosity. Guests leaned closer to one another, whispering about what had just happened. Some looked at me with envy, others with confusion, but I barely noticed. All I could see was him, standing there as if the rest of the world didn't exist. I wanted to look away, to escape the intensity of that moment, but my body betrayed me. I was rooted to the spot, caught between humiliation and something I didn't dare name. His words had turned my shame into something electric, and I didn't know how to hold it. Finally, he extended his hand, not toward the bride, not toward anyone else, but toward me. His voice was low, almost intimate, though loud enough for me to hear over the music that had started playing again. Come, let's walk. Every muscle in my body hesitated, but my heart surged forward. With trembling fingers, I placed my hand in his. The warmth of his palm wrapped around mine, steady and grounding, pulling me out of the storm of stairs and into something unknown. As we moved past the crowd, I caught glimpses of faces, some stunned, some smirking, some openly disapproving. But none of it mattered. His hand didn't let go, and in that small gesture, I felt a safety I hadn't known I craved. He led me toward the balcony, away from the glittering chandeliers and the murmuring crowd. My thoughts spun in 1,000 directions, but one question rose louder than all the rest. Why me? Out of everyone in that dazzling room, why had he chosen to notice the girl who spilled the wine? I didn't have the answer then, but deep down I knew this was only the beginning of a story I would never forget. The night air wrapped around us as we stepped onto the balcony. It was cooler out there, the hum of voices fading behind the glass doors, replaced by the soft sound of crickets and distant city lights. My heart was still racing, my hand trembling slightly in his, though he held it with the same calm assurance as before. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stared at the skyline, afraid that if I looked directly at him, I'd drown in the weight of everything I didn't understand. But silence has a way of pressing against your chest until you're forced to break it. Why did you say that? I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended. Back there, in front of everyone? He turned toward me, and when I met his gaze, there was no hesitation in his eyes. Because it was true, he said simply, and because you needed to hear it. The words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to argue, to laugh it off, to call him out for teasing me, but there was no trace of a joke in his expression. He spoke with the kind of honesty that makes you believe, even when believing feels impossible. I looked down at my dress, smoothing the fabric nervously. Beautiful, I whispered, almost to myself. I don't think anyone's ever called me that before. Not like that. He tilted his head slightly, studying me as though I were a puzzle he wanted to solve. Then they haven't been looking closely enough. Something inside me cracked then, not in a painful way, but like a door opening, letting light into a room I had kept locked for years. I wanted to ask him why he noticed me, what he saw that no one else did, but instead, I found myself asking a smaller question, one that carried more weight than I realized. Do you mean it? His answer came without pause. Every word. Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was soft, like a blanket wrapped around us, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. I could feel my heartbeat settling, though my chest still ached from the intensity of it all. Finally, I smiled, small, hesitant, but real. You have no idea how much I needed to hear that tonight. He returned the smile, though his carried a kind of knowing, as if he understood more than he let on. Maybe I do, he said. And in that quiet moment, standing under the stars with a billionaire who saw me differently than anyone ever had, I realized the night wasn't about spilled wine anymore. It was about something far rarer. Being seen, being chosen, when I least expected it. Standing on that balcony, with his words echoing inside me, something began to change. For most of my life, I had carried around this invisible weight, the belief that I wasn't enough, not beautiful enough, not confident enough, not worthy enough. It had followed me like a shadow, shaping how I walked into rooms, how I spoke, even how I looked at myself in the mirror. But in that moment, with the city lights flickering below us, I felt something break free. His words didn't erase years of doubt, but they cracked the wall I had built around myself. It wasn't just that he called me beautiful. It was the way he said it with conviction, as if he wasn't giving me a compliment, but reminding me of something I had forgotten. I thought about how I had walked into the wedding that night, shrinking myself so small, praying not to be noticed. And yet, here I was, noticed in the most impossible, unimaginable way. Not for what I spilled, not for the mistake everyone had seen, but for something deeper. For me. As I looked at him, I realized beauty wasn't about glittering gowns or polished perfection. It was about presence, about being fully yourself, even when you feel out of place. Somehow he had seen that in me when I couldn't see it in myself. I let out a laugh then, soft and shaky, but real. You know, this feels like some kind of story people tell, but never actually live. He smiled, eyes warm. Sometimes life writes better stories than we do. And maybe he was right. Maybe fate had led me to that wedding for a reason bigger than family obligations or awkward small talk. Maybe I was meant to spill that glass of wine. Maybe I was meant to stand in this exact moment, learning that the version of myself I had carried, the invisible one, the overlooked one, wasn't the truth. The truth was standing here, alive and beating in my chest. I was enough. That realization settled over me like the cool night air, refreshing, freeing. For the first time in a long time, I didn't want to disappear. I didn't want to blend in. I wanted to stand there, under the stars, fully present in my own skin. I glanced at him, my lips curving into a smile I couldn't hold back. "Thank you," I whispered, not just for his words, but for reminding me of something I had lost along the way. He nodded, as if he understood exactly what I meant without needing me to explain. And in that quiet, I felt the shift inside me take root, a promise that I would never see myself the same way again. And that was the night everything changed. Not because I met a billionaire, not because of his words alone, but because I finally saw myself differently. Sometimes it takes one unexpected moment, one person looking at you with truth in their eyes, to remind you that you've always been enough. I walked into that wedding feeling invisible, but I left carrying something priceless, a new belief in my own worth. If you've ever doubted yourself, if you've ever felt out of place or unseen, let this story remind you. You are more than you think you are, and maybe fate is just waiting for the right moment to show you. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe and follow for more powerful love stories that just might change how you see life, love, and yourself.